Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our briefing on our first report, Taking Stock, Protecting, Restoring and Improving the Environment in England. I'm Jenna Hadley, I'm the Principal Communications and Engagement Manager for the OEP, and I'll be hosting today's event. And I'd just like to take the time to thank everybody for meeting with us today. Joining me, we will have our Chair, Dame Glenys Stacey, who will be starting the proceedings beforehand. Board Member Julie Hill and our Chief Insights Officer, Dr. Simon Brockington, who will be taking us through the building blocks of our report. During the presentations, you will be able to submit questions if you want to do that in the Slido box, which I think will be on the left-hand side of your screen. We'll be coming through to all of those at the end of the presentations. We'll do our best to answer and any that we don't get to, we will make sure that we contact you post-event. I'm going to be handing over to Dame Glenys Stacey now, who'll be taking us through our welcome.
Hello there, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us as we launch our first review of government's progress in protecting, restoring and improving the environment. The country's first 25-year environmental plan, as you know, was an ambitious attempt to confront the challenges facing the environment, but progress towards delivering that ambition has been too slow. We continue to see worrying and persistent trends of environmental decline. We all know that our rivers are in a poor state. We see that bird and too many other species numbers are in serious decline. And there are other trends too. Some of them insidious. Poor air quality threatens the health of many, and our seas and sea floor are not being managed sustainably. And you know that I could go on with a longer list, but turning this around isn't easy. We appreciate that, but with the Environment Act, government has a precious opportunity to set a firmer course for the environment, to be sure-footed and certain in delivering its stated commitment to leave the environment in a better state for future generations. With government poised now to set statutory targets and produce a second 25-year plan, we've taken the chance at the OEP to take stock, to take a strategic look at the environmental stewardship arrangements in place. We've asked ourselves if government can deliver its ambitions for the environment, if things stay as they are, and we think not. A change of pace and direction is needed. Now, I've spoken previously about the four cornerstones of the Environment Act, and you'll be familiar with these, new statutory targets, the environmental principles and policy statement, future environmental improvement plans, and of course the OEP. And these cornerstones are so welcome, and each needs to be as weighty as possible. Each has great potential. And of course, we have the OEP now, and as the OEP, we call on government to ensure that it does everything possible to meet the deadlines for those other cornerstones. But cornerstones alone don't lay the ground fully. We need firm foundations as well. And if I can just take that analogy just a little bit further, if I may, we've been working on those foundations ahead of government's next iteration of the 25-year plan, and we've identified 6 what we call building blocks that need to be as solid as they can be if government is to achieve its stated aims for the environment. So we all know, that we're edging seemingly inexorably towards real tipping points for the environment. But government can in large part arrest these adverse trends if it has the will. So we press government to take stock now of the true state of the environment and to consider whether its current strategies and policies are working well enough, because in our view, change is most certainly needed. And we want to see government develop a clear and ambitious vision for the environment to match that of climate change, and to be clear then about its priorities for the environment, recognizing that some matters are so pressing. In our view, government must take the opportunity, as it's developing now its next 25-year plan, to prioritise, yes, and also to set clear goals, each with ambitious targets, because well-developed, well-considered targets, they really do provide certainty and shape and drive delivery. Now, we all have a tangible inarguable dependency on our environment now and forever, and its precarious state should, in our view, be a matter of real concern for the whole of government and a national priority. It's not simply a matter for one department, DEFRA, to deliver government's ambitions for the environment at the pace now needed. We press for strong cross-government governance and accountability, but with clarity about its vision, its goals, its priorities and wider governance arrangements, government can then review and develop a coherent set of strategies and policies and delivery arrangements centred around delivery of the next 25-year plan goals and targets. And then we end our report by pressing for effective monitoring and evaluation arrangements really aligned to the government's ambitions, targets and goals for the environment. This is always important. We all know that. It is so often neglected, but effective monitoring and astute and timely evaluation is especially important now, given the urgent need for progress. Now, we're not naive. We appreciate that the environment must compete for attention with the exceptional wider pressures on government now and for the near future. But our message to government is clear. Do not delay in making the changes necessary to protect, restore and improve the environment. Instead, give it the priority that it deserves. There is an urgent and pressing need. Now, I do hope that as you read our report, you will find it clear and compelling. But before I hand over to my colleagues here to talk about our report in more detail, I thought I'd just look quickly ahead to the coming months so you know what we're up to and what's coming. So it's been a busy time for us, as I'm sure it's been for all of you. There have been some important consultations taking place, and our response to those consultations and our advice to government on biodiversity net gain, on the Green Paper on nature recovery, on the joint fisheries statement, and of course the environmental targets. These will all be made public over the next few weeks. And you'll see they've all actually been greatly informed by what you see in the report we're launching today. Alongside that, we're finalising now our own strategy and enforcement policy following our own consultation. I know many of you, incidentally, contributed to that, and I'd like to thank those who did. We received nigh on 70 responses, a decent number, and I can say that they were broadly in support of our approach, but with some high quality insights and challenges that we've been thinking through carefully. So our final strategy and enforcement policy will be out in just a few months' time, and then we're also developing our first corporate plan, a document precious to us actually, because it will set out our priorities and our work programme for the next 3 years. As you will appreciate, we have been considering very carefully how to make the best possible difference to the environment and live our role to the full. And I must say, having recently vested, it's just a great pleasure to get started on this real work. So thank you for coming today, and I'm going to hand you over now to our Chief Executive, Natalie, to start taking us through some of the detail of the report. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you, Dame Glenys, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Natalie Prosser, CEO here at the OEP. So I'm delighted to be hosting this panel today, which will talk through our report and each of the building blocks in greater detail. And I'll be joined by Julie Hill, MBE. Julie's a non-executive member of our board. In addition to her role with us, Julie is currently the chair of the Waste and Resources Action Programme, WRAP, chair of the Institution of Environmental Sciences, and Deputy Chair of the Advisory Committee for Social Science for the Food Standards Agency. As you can tell from that impressive resume, Julie brings a wealth of experience to our board. I'm very grateful for the guidance that Julie, alongside the rest of our board, has provided for this report. Also joining us today is Dr. Simon Brockington, who joined the OEP this year as our Chief Insights Officer. Simon joined the OEP from DEFRA, where he led DEFRA's work on the marine environment, including planning and licensing at sea, as well as completion of the network of marine conservation zones. He led proposals to establish the first highly protected marine areas in UK waters. Simon gained his PhD in marine biology while living and diving in Antarctica. Simon, together with his Insights team, led the work on preparing this report. I also want to take a moment to express our gratitude to all of our stakeholders, and I know many of you are here with us today who have worked with us as we have developed this report and whose excellent thinking and work we have drawn upon. Thank you. As Jenna said at the start, we will make sure that there is time and opportunity to hear from you and to answer your questions once we've taken you through our report. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So many of you will be familiar with us at the OEP. You'll have been watching us with interest, but I just wanted to set out a little bit of information about us to get us started. So the OEP is a brand new public body. Our powers came into force just in January this year. And as you can see on the slide there, our overall mission is to protect and improve the environment by holding government and other public authorities to account. We have a range of functions that allow us to do that. So, for example, we can investigate and enforce where there are serious failures to comply with environmental law by public authorities. We can monitor and report on matters of environmental law, provide advice to government on proposed changes to environmental law, and other matters related to the natural environment. But we're here today in relation to our function to formally scrutinise progress on the government's environmental improvement plans. And as you will know, the 25-year environment plan is the first of those, as well as statutory targets. Now, we're taking a slightly different approach for this inaugural report. We've set out what we think needs to be in place for national level environmental stewardship. We want to shift the focus to action to drive the delivery of environmental improvements. And as Dame Glenys has mentioned, we've proposed a framework of 6 building blocks that we believe need to be in place to enable government to best protect, restore and improve the environment in England. Our ambition with this report is to be helpful to government as we look forward to a strengthened EIP next year, as well as new targets, implementation of environmental principles, and the continued development of the underlying monitoring framework. Now I'm going to hand over shortly to Julie and Simon, who are going to talk you through the 6 building blocks that we have proposed alongside our recommendations in this report. I hope you find the session helpful, and please do submit your questions to us. So I'd now like to hand over to Julie Hill. Julie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and thank you for that very kind introduction. As Natalie said, we very much hope that our way of approaching this is helpful to government to set out what we feel are these building blocks of an effective environmental improvement plan process. And so what I'm going to do together with Simon is take you through each of these 6 and just say a little bit more about why we feel these are important and explain our recommendations a little. So very many thanks for joining us to hear our recommendations today. So the first point is we need to see a comprehensive stocktake of where we are. The beginning of any good plan is to know where we are. But what do we mean by stocktake exactly? Well, part of that, of course, is understanding the state of the environment, but not just understanding it in the sense of having a current snapshot, but understanding the trends. Where are we going? And also, very importantly, if we are to seriously set out to halt and reverse those trends, we have to understand the pressures on the environment, and we have to understand what's driving those pressures, whether that is agricultural policy, for instance, development of land, changes to transport policy. All of these things will be long-term factors. And so to have an effective long-term plan, we need to understand them thoroughly. That said, we know enough to act now. That is not in any way an argument to wait for more information or for more understanding. We express in our report very serious concerns about continuing declines to the environment. You've already heard Dame Glenys mention some of them. We know we're the most biodiversity depleted, one of the most biodiversity depleted countries in the world. Underneath that, the soils beneath our feet are severely degraded. That's one that doesn't often get so much attention. Air pollution, we know, is a threat to our health. That's becoming very serious. And the marine environment perhaps gets less attention because we can't see it so well, but there's degradation of a very serious kind going on there. So we know about these declines, and we also know that some of these pressures are more urgent and more harmful and more widespread than others. And that's why we started to talk about prioritisation. I mean, we do recognise there's a need to respond to all environmental pressures, but if we don't prioritise some and take urgent action, there's a risk of activity being dissipated. So hence our call to clarify priorities. If I could have my next slide, please. So the next important thing is about creating a vision. Again, I think we know that a clear and passionate vision is the first step to change for almost any organisation, and it's certainly the key to improving our environment. And we have an incredible vision in a way in the 25-year plan. Even having a 25-year plan is a pretty unprecedented thing to do. And that ambition to be the first generation to leave the natural environment of England in a better state than this generation inherited is a very, very strong vision. But at the same time, it's now been 10 years since that was set out. And we're concerned that it's not driving actions in a way that match the urgency and the seriousness of the situation. And that may well be because that vision hasn't been stated clearly enough, or it hasn't been stated in enough places. We've reviewed quite a lot of the strategic documents that underpin government's plans, and that overarching vision for the environment is not nearly as clearly stated as, for instance, the net zero vision, which we know has had huge drive and commitment from across government to start to give it life. And if we don't have this consistent vision, and if it doesn't have the same gravitas and urgency as the net zero vision, we fear we won't be making progress on enough fronts. So the vision stated clearly across government, and that same gravitas as the net zero vision, we feel is very important to making progress. If I could have the next slide, please. And then we talk a lot about target setting. Targets are crucial, of course. They drive delivery towards a vision. But again, we don't feel they're driving the scale or urgency of response that we really need. So we talk about coherency. Why that word particularly? Well, in looking at what we have already, there's a huge proliferation of targets, but they're not necessarily well connected. They're not necessarily applied. They sometimes get missed. There's often little explanation of how targets are meant to work together, whether they're all driving in the same direction. And to our knowledge, there's no single place where all the environmental targets are gathered together, so we can see the strategic intent across the piece. And for instance, looking at targets in the waste and resource area, which is one of my areas of expertise, it's not clear how they work together to drive towards, for instance, the stated ambition towards a more circular economy. So what we're asking for here is some sense of hierarchy with what we call apex targets at the top. And what we mean by that are those are the targets that should absolutely crystallize what's at stake, what are the outcomes we want, rather than targets that perhaps are the easiest to measure or the easiest to show improvement in the shorter term. So these most important apex targets, and we feel we need these for all the environmental improvement plan goals, and then clear line of sight between their complementary targets and the policies and delivery measures, and critically the indicators that are going to show that we're getting there. And we know that government does fall short of targets, but that is not a reason to not have them. We've got to continue to set stretching targets. We know if those are well set out, they can drive innovation and transformative change, which is what we're going to need. So we do still want ambitious targets. And we now, of course, have the opportunity to put some of those on a legal basis under the Environment Act. And again, we know that giving legal status to targets, as with with the net zero target, does help drive progress. So that's the first three building blocks of a more effective plan. And I'd now like to hand over to Simon to take us through a bit of the detail on the next three. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Julie, and good afternoon, everybody. The first three building blocks that Julie has run us through there on understanding the environment, setting a vision and developing targets, of course, those are the tools that government use to set direction. The second half of our report and the last three building blocks that I'm going to run us through now, these are the tools for delivering action against that direction. So our fourth building block is, as you see on the screen, strategy and policy. And of course, the role of strategy and policy is to diagnose specific issues and then to assemble the solutions against those issues. Our first recommendation in this field is for coherency. The annual performance report for the 25-year environment plan identifies that DEFRA is operating around 47 different strategies to look after the environment, all of which are at different states of development. Some are planned, some are nascent, some are in operation, others are mature or in the process of being replaced. Well, we recognise that the range of strategies is necessary, but there needs to be coherency between them. Without that coherency, things can fall between the gaps, and worse, actions can simply dissolve down to just a long list of activities rather than a cohesive, planned response. So coherency is important. Our second recommendation in this field is for integration. Environmental priorities can frequently overlap, and so we add our voice to calls already made by the National Audit Authority, the Environmental Audit Committee and Treasury in highlighting the need for integration. And indeed, we give an example in our report of the need for integration in just one policy area, that of biodiversity loss, where we show that there's over 30 different policies all contributing to that one goal, and we identify opportunities to improve the integration. The proposed food strategy, for example, will be effective at bringing together policy in not just food, but also in land use and in environment. And at an even higher level, perhaps above the level of DEFRA as a department, we see the need for integration across the green growth strategy and also the levelling up strategy, both of which need to do more to take account of environmental priorities. And finally, on this building block, we highlight the overriding importance of evaluation. There can be a tendency to, when policies and strategies come to their conclusion, if the targets haven't been met, we're seeing a tendency for those strategies to be replaced with even more ambitious strategies set even further into the future. Well, we applaud the ambition, of course, but what we think is important is that there's a period of evaluation, a stock take, where government understands why the last set of strategies may not have worked as desired and put in place the solutions to those in developing the next set of strategies. And if I could move on to the next building block, please, and that is governance. So whereas strategy and policy, of course, dictate the actions, it's governance and governance across the whole of government that brings together the people and the resources that will drive the activity. The range of actors involved with environmental stewardship is considerable. It's not just DEFRA and its 33 arm's length bodies, of course, but it's also a number of other government departments, as well as a huge range of local delivery agencies, as well as partners in industry and in the environmental non-governmental organisation sector as well. So here we add our voice to the calls already made by the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee in calling for greater accountability for who is responsible for the actions in the 25-year environment plan and how they're resourced. And our second recommendation under governance is the application of the environmental principles. Our chair, Dame Glenys Stacey, in her introductory remarks a few minutes ago, underscored the importance of the environmental principles as a key component of the Environment Act. And we very much applaud government's actions, I think just yesterday, to lay the draft environmental principles policy statement in Parliament, and we hope that that comes into force as soon as possible. Moving to our next building block on monitoring, please, then, so that's the next slide, then our first recommendation here is for a purpose-driven monitoring programme. Now, we really welcome the outcome indicator framework, which is published alongside the 25-year environment plan. It's truly wonderful to see such an extensive and comprehensive compilation of all of the England's monitoring schemes all into one place. And we absolutely applaud the work that's gone into compiling that document. But if we could make one observation on it, it would be that those monitoring schemes have not been developed for the purpose of the 25-year environment plan. Rather, they've been developed for a range of other strategic and policy initiatives. And the trouble there is that they're not directly aligned to the 25-year Environment Plan goals, and there's a number of critical gaps. Areas such as soils springs to mind, for example. So we ask for a more purpose-driven monitoring programme and the establishment of baselines as a part of it. Our second recommendation on environmental assessment is around the role of the Office for National Statistics. And we've worked with the ONS in developing this recommendation, and we see a much greater role for the ONS in taking ownership of environmental reporting as the 25-year Environment Plan becomes more important in driving government policy. We absolutely applaud the ONS's work in starting to report the carbon costs of GDP, and we also applaud the work of the ONS in starting to do much more to understand habitat and environmental effects as well. So we see much more role for the ONS in helping monitoring and assessment going forwards. And then last but not least, we would recommend to government that they develop their own methodology for assessing their own progress against environmental improvement plans in advance of actually making that assessment. We welcome the annual progress reports, but as I've intimated, we tend to see them as a list of completed to-do lists rather than an objective-based assessment of moving towards environmental progress. So there we have it. Those are our 6 building blocks, and we commend those as the elements of national stewardship. But we see a number of conclusions which drop out of these building blocks, and I'll just run through those quickly now. Our first overriding conclusion, and we have three of these, is for urgency. As Dame Glenys said in her introduction, it's 10 years since the government set its ambition to leave the environment in a better state for future generations. And incredibly, it's already 4 years since the 25-year Environment Plan was published in 2018. We see a need to crack on with the actions to deliver to prevent the further decline of biodiversity and indeed to drive forward its recovery. Our second overarching conclusion is that of coherence, and we mean coherence across the whole of our building blocks. From vision, from targets, from strategy and policy, there's a need for more coherence and a more driven action across each of these in order to define the areas where we want to see environmental improvement and drive them forwards. And then, last but not least, we see a role for greater accountability. That's accountability not just within DEFRA and its arm's length bodies, but across all government departments, and to give accountability in a way that allows delivery bodies to assemble the skills and capabilities they need, and for government and those delivery bodies to evaluate their progress. So this is our first inaugural environment report. As Natalie said, we've taken the opportunity to step back a little bit and evaluate what's required for a national level environmental stewardship programme. We present our building blocks as the key element of national stewardship, and our report assesses government's progress against each of those building blocks. We absolutely welcome and support all of the work the government is doing. We would like it to move faster and to be more effective. Now, with that, I know that you'll have a range of questions, and I believe everybody in the panel stands ready to answer them. And so I'm going to hand back to Jenna, and Jenna's going to collect your questions and help the panel answer them. So thank you for your attention.
Okay, everyone, so we are into the Q&A portion of the event now. So on the left of the screen, you'll see a Slido where you can type in any questions. We have got one that's come through asking us, are we confident in meeting all the timescales? So if I could hand that over to the panel, whoever would like to answer that question.
Perhaps I could start with that one then, because we're certainly meeting the tight timescales that government has set for responding and giving advice on its various consultations. You know, we've been working very hard to make sure that we do the best possible job we can there in the time we've got, and none of our responses are late, so we're doing fine. I suppose the timescale we might be most concerned about, though, is in relation to the publication of the next 25-year plan. So we know that DEFRA is understandably already working on this. And here we come along with some big recommendations really about how to get to a better plan. Now, our report comes on the back of earlier annual reports from the Natural Capital Committee, and we're very grateful for those. So many of the things that we're saying have been said by others in one form or another as well, not necessarily all together in one place, but I would say that in many senses, our report doesn't really stand alone. It doesn't come out of the blue. Indeed, we're grateful to the Natural Capital Committee and to others, the Environmental Audit Committee particularly, and the NAO, for putting these arguments forward. So we don't think it's too late, actually, to influence thinking there. And we're already working alongside the relevant people in DEFRA, hoping and working hard to influence for the better so we can get to a really good second 25-year plan. Has anyone on the panel got anything else to say about timescales? I think we're just running with them, aren't we? Running being the operative word. Yeah.
Okay. We're just getting another couple of questions through now. So we have one from Ruth Chambers, who has said, very much welcome this timely and clear report, totally endorse the recommendation for greater urgency. Are there any particular areas or actions that you would see as priorities for urgent action by the government?
Thank you. If I start this, then perhaps Simon, you could come in. So there are clearly a number of issues, all have a legitimate sort of claim, if you like, to be at the top of the list. And it is for government, of course, to set those priorities. We recognise that. But to assist government, we have provided in an annex to our report some indications of what we think the priorities might be. So we identify within, for example, the areas of freshwater, air quality, soil, biodiversity and other areas, what we think some of the priorities might be for government. But Simon, you might want to expand on one or two of those, and particularly perhaps in relation to marine.
Yes, thank you, Dame Glenys. So it is always a difficult exercise to given that all environmental issues are important, it's clearly difficult to choose those that should come to the top of the pile. I think the overarching comment we'd make is that we would hope that government moves expediently, not just to replace or refresh the environmental improvement plan due January next year, but also, of course, to stick to the timetable required to establish environmental targets. But Ruth, your question was, I think, about the more specific issues here. And here, as Dame Glenys says, we've provided an annex to the report, Annex 1, where we've highlighted what we believe to be the most urgent environmental issues. And looking down that list, some look quicker than others to start to rectify. Dame Glenys has mentioned the state of the marine environment, and we hugely support DEFRA's work to improve the management of offshore marine protected areas. There have been controls come into place in recent months. That just leaves still quite a very large number and a large geographical extent of marine area needing additional levels of control. And given the mechanisms are established, it should be reasonably straightforward to add those controls in place. I think the other areas I'd mentioned, just as Dame Glenys has started to highlight, is the importance of dealing with air pollution. It's clearly having an effect on human populations, something we very much need to get on top of. And the other area that I would suggest is important is on agricultural runoff and use of nutrients, and particularly the effect on soils, and particularly the effect on aquatic watercourses. So those would be the areas that we highlight, but obviously very much recognising it's for government to set its own priorities.
Okay, thank you, Simon. And has anyone else got anything to add before we move on?
Well, I was just going to add into that. Sorry, Jenna. Obviously, one dimension of urgency might be irreversible effects. So I think we know there are places, species decline, particularly the impacts of climate change, some things going on in the marine environment where damage may be irreversible. So naturally, that is something to factor strongly into priorities.
Okay, great, thank you. Our next question is from Jennifer, who has asked, will you be consulting publicly when the plan is next reviewed?
I assume you're talking there about the 25-year plan, are you? Because it's not our plan, so we wouldn't be consulting on that. There's a bit of confusion there.
Yeah, I presume it will be the 25-year plan.
We're not government in that sense. It'll be for government to decide how it finalises its 25-year plan. What we are doing is trying to influence it now ahead of publication next year.
Okay, great. Moving on to the next question from Hugh Clearhill. There have been some indications that a review of ALBs and potential amalgamations is being considered. Does the panel have any thoughts on this?
I'm going to jump in again because I like questions of design, but Natalie, I know you're pretty skilled in this area as well, but I think this has been around for a while, hasn't it? You know, a concern that we're not set up well to get on top of the environment and improve it in the way that government wishes. And I've no doubt that post-Brexit government sees particular opportunities here, you know, to organise itself differently. I think our view would be that we would welcome any steps that make it more likely that government's ambitions for the environment are met. You know, that's what it's about. And there are opportunities actually to organise differently, but there are risks as well. Of course, there are risks as well. So the opportunity is to focus so much more on actually the delivery of the next 25-year plan. So yes, we want that plan. We want to be the best it can be, but we also want delivery arrangements that are really shaped around it, you know, that we can see. So let's take one example. We've been talking, Simon was talking just now about the need for effective monitoring and evaluation. Julie's spoken about getting a grip on the state of the environment now and understanding trends and so on. That although there's been some investment, welcome investment in areas of monitoring, responsibilities for monitoring whether or not government actually achieves what it's trying to achieve in its 25-year plan, whether or not it's doing it in a timely way, whether there needs to be any course correction, that's all really diffuse. And a really good strategic aim for any review of the way staff are configured will be to say, well, actually, we really want to do that. We want a programme. This is what it really ought to look like. And this is what we expect. And making sure that responsibility for that was given purposefully, clearly, responsibility and accountability allocated to a body or a system so that we could be sure that it happens. So I think, you know, we don't set our face against any reorganisation. Instead, we see there are opportunities, but of course one would want to see it managed well. But I don't know whether the panel would like to add anything else. Natalie, particularly, you have good experience in this area.
I just endorse everything that you've said there, Dame Glenys. I don't think we at the OEP have any particular view on how DEFRA should be configured, but we do think it should be configured to optimise the likelihood of it successfully delivering on its ambitions, and that purpose is right at the heart of any organisational design. And if there is an opportunity to look at the configuration through that lens, then that's something that we would welcome and be supportive of.
And if I could perhaps just add, however it's configured, the key thing is having the right skills and capabilities. All these things we've talked about require very key skills, systems thinking, being able to monitor effectively and interpret that data. These are all things that we're going to need to see coming through our future arrangements.
Just going back as well to the risks, I mean, there are a good number of things that are done by DEFRA's arm's length bodies at the moment that must continue to be done and to be done well. For example, the ready response to animal disease emergencies, effective flood management and control, the management of payments to farmers and landowners. There's a good body of real operational work, if you like, that needs to be done and continue to be done and continue to be protected in whatever arrangements are to come. So when we're looking at risks, you know, that's a risk. But you know, if you're reconfiguring, that somehow you can inadvertently weaken those arrangements, and that's not what any sensible government would wish to see, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the next one from Jennifer Godwin. With reference to the need for more evaluation and tendency to quickly move on to longer term policy ambitions, are the panel able to share any thoughts on the proposals set out in the Nature Recovery Green Paper?
Simon, do you want to deal with that, or I'm happy to deal with it?
I'll I'll make a few remarks, but Dame Glenys, please do jump in after me. The Nature Recovery Green Paper, of course, is out for consultation right now, and this is quite a wide-ranging set of proposals here, all designed to improve nature recovery. I think perhaps, Jennifer, that the heart of the proposals you're referring to may well be around habitats, regulations, assessment reform, and also reform to the Protected Areas series. And the OEP, just like I'm sure many bodies, has just made its advice and consultation responses on this subject, and you'll be able to see our response on our website. We absolutely recognise the case that government makes for reform in these areas. The protected areas regime and the mechanisms that manage activities on sites have grown up over many years, and they've come from many different legislative strands. And simplification and simplicity, of course, is always a desirable trait. At the same time, as Dame Glenys has just intimated on arm's length body reform, it's important to maintain the functionality as those reforms come through. And so that's the heart of our views there, and we stand very ready to work with government as it makes its reforms and to make sure that important functionality, and particularly the visibility for industry as well as for the environmental sector, is maintained throughout that transition. But Dame Glenys, you might wish to add to that.
No, I would agree with that. And just to say that the tenor of our advice here is that, yes, of course, government can change these regulations, but it mustn't weaken the overall strength of the current arrangements. Indeed, it should take the opportunity to strengthen them and to provide greater opportunity to protect, restore, and enhance our environment. But what we also suggest is whether or not government is going to take a legislative route, there are ways in which the current arrangements could be significantly improved. And our argument is that government should get on and do that, regardless of whether it intends to make any other change, because time is passing. You know, there's a target for 2030. It's only 8 years away, for goodness sake. You know, let's actually get cracking. And there are ways which we set out, actually, in our advice as to how arrangements could be yet better, whether or not government then intends to legislate, because a lot of it can be done without legislation.
Okay, thank you. We have a message now from Keith James, who has asked, Annex 1 appears... Oh, sorry, that one's just scrolled down. Annex 1 appears to answer the question for building block 1 on drivers and pressures. What would the panel like to see government do further on understanding drivers?
Can I suggest Simon picks that one up?
I'll do my best. That's quite a deep question. We're very mindful of our responsibility at the OEP. We're not government. Our role is to hold government to account. What we have sought to do with Annex 1 is to show that that whilst all environmental issues are important, some we feel need prioritisation and need to go further. And we give an example illustration of those pressures in Annex 1. Now, you're quite right. To make progress on those drivers, it's really important to make progress against those pressures, it's really important to understand the differential drivers. We allude to a number of the drivers in those areas, but I think really our recommendations around setting targets and particularly around strategy and policy come into play here, because we see that those building blocks are the ones that identify the actions and the causes and come up with the creative mechanisms for allowing those pressures to be reduced whilst also allowing development to go ahead as well. So if there was one thing that I think we're seeking to do here, it is to help government to inform and improve the next environmental improvement plan, due of course just a few months away in January of next year, such that it is much more of a plan directed at action, as opposed to recognition of all of the competing areas of environment. But I'll just check in case anybody else in the panel would like to add to that.
There was just something I wanted to add, and I know that Emma's here from the Environment Agency. Hello there, Emma. We're not the most immediate sort of oversight body on the ground. There are a series of public authorities between us and the ground, including the Environment Agency, but other oversight bodies as well. And all oversight bodies, when they see matters of concern, when they see non-compliance, they tend to ask themselves, you know, why? In fact, they might ask the question 3 times, why, and why, and then you might get to the answer. And I suspect Emma might well herself say that, in an ideal world, those immediate oversight bodies really need to try and understand why, why things are going in an adverse way, why there is an element of non-compliance, with landowners, for example, or water companies or whatever. There is a job to be done on the ground, really to keep close, I think, to trends and concerns, and to try and understand why. It's often not for the most obvious reason that things are going awry. But I don't know whether you want to come in on that, Emma, and whether you think that's fair. I'm assuming she's here, but I don't. She's on the list, aren't you, Emma? But whether you're actually here and whether you can actually join, I don't know. Not so familiar with this technology. I might have overstretched it there.
No, we can't.
We can dial other participants in.
No.
Yeah, I'm afraid not. Should we move on to the next question? Yep, we've got Brendan Freeman, who has thanked for the timely and comprehensive report and asked how the government can ensure that climate risks are better considered in the delivery of environmental outcomes.
Well, yes, what a vitally important question. There is a slight tendency, perhaps, for us as a country to treat climate and environment as slightly separate. We have an Office for Environmental Protection and we have a Climate Change Committee. Of course, we work very closely with each other, but there's undoubtedly a need to integrate much more between the two. Nature-based solutions are a massively important part of adapting and coping with climate change. And at the risk of repeating an answer to a question just given, we really hope that the next Environmental Improvement Plan due January will allow us to make some difference there. One area that has stood out for us particularly is around nature reserves. The nature reserves have been set up both on land and in sea to conserve, quite rightly, to conserve biodiversity, to conserve ecology, to conserve rare and threatened species. And it's very nice to see the Green Paper making opportunities for those nature reserves to look at areas designated particularly for recovery. It's particularly important, in addition to conserving habitats and species, that we also start to look at the carbon drawdown which individual habitats offer. It's true both in land and sea. Different habitats draw down carbon at very different rates. And if we were to look at the protected areas network through the lens of nature-based solutions to climate change, we would probably come up with a different set of designations. I think as a country, we're starting to become aware of the importance of this, and it's another reason where some urgency is desperately required. So yes, much more to be done to integrate both nature and climate.
And again, just to add from a sort of waste and resources perspective, getting a finer grained understanding of the carbon impacts of different waste, which feeds back upstream into different types of products, and product design may be one of those areas that could come a bit more to the fore.
Okay, great. So the next question is from Martin Baxter, who says, is the OEP concerned that there are long-term policy goals in the current... Oh, sorry, just lost that question. Sorry, I'll move on to another one quickly. From Sat Pillay, who has thanked us for the excellent approach and has asked, if I have understood correctly, the focus to hold public authorities and government to account, but how will the private sector regulation be addressed?
I think I'm going to suggest that Natalie, you get your voice around that one.
So it's important to remember what role the OEP plays here. The OEP has a responsibility to oversee and hold government and other public authorities to account. And so our remit is confined to those public authorities or a small number of private entities if they're exercising functions of a public nature. So our relationship with the private sector is largely a second line one. I think what I would say is that part of our role is to secure the effectiveness of the overall regulatory system. It's not for us to set policy, it's certainly not for us to set regulatory strategies, but it is our role to support the creation of good and effective laws that can be implemented well by those who are responsible for them directly, and also for us to review and monitor how those laws are being overseen in practice. Now, as a new organisation, we're very much at the start of this kind of activity, but as we progress and as we provide advice to government on new legislation, like we're doing at the moment in response to the potential reform of the habitats regulations in relation to matters like implementation of biodiversity net gain, we will be paying attention as to how those policies are translated into regulations and then into delivery. So it's a very long answer to a question about how the OEP fits into that overarching framework, but it is one that is we're set up to take a broad strategic overview rather than directly involved. I would note, however, that there is real benefit in government providing certainty to the private sector to support and encourage investment in green solutions. And part of that is linked to what we say in this report about clarity and coherence, because that provides more certainty to business in relation to its own investment decisions and also supports innovation from the private sector as well. So it's a roundabout answer, but I hope it addresses your question.
And perhaps I could just add, we've already engaged, I think, very productively with industry and business stakeholders, because, of course, we always want to hear about where they see their contribution and where their contribution is facilitated by the overarching governmental framework. And I think we've had very good discussions on that front, and we look forward to having even more interaction with business in that kind of way.
Okay, great, thank you. We're going back to Martin's question now. Is the OEP concerned that there are long-term policy goals in the current 25-year plan, e.g. resource productivity, that aren't being backed by the proposed legally binding targets?
Let me have a go at that one and then see if anyone else has to come in. So it won't surprise you to know that our advice to government in relation to its consultation on targets and also more general approach in this report is really to press for ambitious targets. That's the first thing. We think that the needs are pressing and there's a very strong case to have ambitious, I think what Simon called apex targets or key targets. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think there are 10 goals in the current version of the plan, 25-year plan, and we can expect broadly the same number perhaps in the next iteration. We argue that each of those should have an apex target, because targets provide certainty, they drive action, people get around them, come together and actually deliver. And so it doesn't seem to be sensible to us or desirable to set out goals, 25-year goals in the plan and not have apex targets and then interim targets and a hierarchy of targets falling from those, focused on the most immediate and priority matters. And then lastly, I would say that, of course, we would argue that as many of those apex targets as possible should be statutory, because that makes them stronger, it makes them more robust, it makes them more enduring, it makes them live through a change of government, and it provides very special certainty to those who can make a difference to those targets being achieved. That would be our general stance on targets. But whether anyone else wants to say any more or elaborate on that, I'll open the floor to others.
So, Dame Glenys, absolutely. And building on that, I think the question, so we absolutely concur that all of the goals in the 25-year environment plan need apex targets. I think the question here is particularly around waste and resources and whether or not the targets framework proposed is sufficient for to drive the action that's necessary on waste and resources. I think we would, as I'm sure the questioner knows, the consultation on targets has just been extended, and we will certainly make our response in due course and place that public when we do. For the waste and resources area in particular, the target proposed by government is one of a reduction in per capita residual waste. And we absolutely recognise that in history, and targets have been successful in driving down contribution to landfill. We absolutely applaud that aim. I think it raises an open question as to whether that one target by itself is sufficiently comprehensive to address the enormity of the problem with waste and resources, and particularly on the conservation of important materials and the transition to a circular economy. Now, Julie, I know you're absolutely expert in this area. You might like to add a little bit more on that particular field.
Well, I think only to echo that, it comes back, I guess, to what we were saying earlier about drivers. What are the most effective targets to set that are going to drive action at the very heart of the matter, as it were? And obviously, circular economy is a big aspiration. There are lots of actors. There are lots of people who have to do things differently, from designing things differently to potentially all of us consuming things differently. It's not just a question of what the end disposal route is. So I think Simon's right. It's still a bit of an open question, and it's one we're thinking about very hard as to what's, what might be better than setting a target as a per capita reduction of per capita residual waste. So as Simon mentioned, that will come forward in our response to the targets consultation.
Okay, great, thank you. We've got a question from Mark Russell now. Monitoring data is essential. Fundamentally, you can't manage what you don't measure. How can the OEP increase awareness around the value of government investing in this area, as recent history shows the level of investment has been reducing?
Yes, and thank you, Mark. And we address this point precisely in building block 6 in our report. We identify a number of data flows which show the reduction in investment in monitoring. What can the OEP do? Well, I think our responsibilities here are the same as they are for all other areas to do with environmental stewardship, in that we need to draw attention to them and highlight the importance. We have absolutely singled on monitoring as one of the key building blocks. We've particularly shown the need for monitoring programs to be driven by the targets and the urgency there. And we have also made a call for strategies and policies to go through an evaluation phase to make sure they are being effective at driving down or improving environmental quality. I think that probably is our role. The other point that is germane is exactly as Dame Glenys was speaking to. In any reform of arm's length bodies, we would absolutely expect to see that reform to centre around government's stated aims for the environment as articulated in the 25-year environment plans, and of course monitoring is a major part in assessing progress there. So yes, very much welcome the question and agree with the premise you're suggesting.
And again, just to sort of add in a bit to that, it's not just a question of measuring what's easy to measure or most available. It's a question of measuring the things that will really help us understand the trends and how things might change. So I think we talk very much about purpose-driven monitoring and really getting to the heart of the insights we need. So it's about directing the monitoring as well as devoting resource to it.
Okay, great. Our next question is from Paula Chin, who has asked, regarding cross-government cooperation, what needs to happen to make this more effective? There seems to be so many competing priorities from different departments which undermine action on the environment.
So shall I start and then see if anyone else wants to come in? Yeah, so it's a very pertinent point, and one that we make in our report. Again, one of our building blocks is about strengthening overall governance for the environment. And there are a couple of things we think that could improve there. So as I perhaps indicated when I first spoke today, this isn't just an issue for DEFRA, the environment, it's too big. You know, DEFRA has a key role to play, a really important part to play, but it's not the only part. And we are proposing or suggesting or recommending actually in our report that you need better cross-governmental governance arrangements. Now, we don't design those for government, but there are a number of models out there that actually bring around the table key departments that actually do have a real influence on the environment because of the policy areas they operate in. So there's a way, you know, there are clearly ways in which that could be more joined up with a common agenda. Secondly, government has just laid, I think, its environmental principles policy statement that's a really important document. Thankfully, one that we at the OEP have been able to influence for the better, as I understand it, from our advice. But this is actually calling upon departments as they develop their strategies and policies to think about the environment and the impact on the environment of what they're recommending, and to think about that very early on in the process. And that's really important, that people think right from the beginning and think very carefully and quantify, if they can, the potential impact on the environment of anything they're recommending, and think about ways to avoid it. Go through that hierarchy of thinking. So starting by, well, have we really got to have this impact? And we really do want to see those environmental principles embedded across central government departments. We want to see the guidance followed, and we have a strong interest in scrutinising how that works over time. I think there's so much to be gained, really, by getting that embedded properly. But others may have other contributions to make to the debate.
So I'd just like to build on some things that Dame Glenys has said there. We really see a role for strong centralised leadership to help facilitate that collaboration across government. And it'd be remiss of us not to note that DEFRA has made efforts to do exactly this. The OEP is not the first organisation to raise this as being critically important, and steps in the right direction have been taken. What we want to see is more. And we know it can be done, because we've seen it in the commitment to net zero within government, that has had that impact. It has become a much more embedded way of thinking across all of those government departments that have their role to play. And we think there is a lot to be learned from how that has been achieved, and bringing it in line with these broader environmental ambitions. So the principal policy statement will be really, really critical, but what is important now is that that becomes part of the way of thinking in how policy is made, when that policy is going to impact in one way or another on our natural environment. And that's really what we at the OEP will continue to advocate for as we move forward.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. So we've got one from Ellen Fay. We still have no baseline indicator or change data for soils, and progress is slow. We also have no soil-specific protections for soils. Do you see calling for this a priority in the EOP, given that soil is therefore not in the Environmental Act?
Well, I think
soil is one of the areas that our board is considering as a priority. And as I've said, we will be producing our corporate plan in 2-3 months' time, and we'll set out what we are actually going to tackle over the next 3 years. But certainly soil is very much on the agenda. And the measurement of soil, it's so interesting to me. I mean, for a long time, I suppose, since I was working in animal health, which is now APA, which is 15 years ago, there were strong debates, let's put it that way, about how one might measure soil. And there are any number of contrary views about it, but I take a rather simple stance that let's just start with some measures, please. Let's just start with and get on with it. And I appreciate that it's particularly difficult because of the way the composition and condition of soil can change, within a few feet. But that's no reason not to start a common way of measuring, and I would certainly advocate any and coming behind any efforts to do that.
I think from my perspective, it's curious to me and to us at the OEP that soil health is not given the prominence and attention that we think it deserves. It's such an incredibly important part of our ecosystem. It's relevant to protecting ourselves against climate change. It's important in terms of management of flood, in terms of diffuse pollution, and it's important in terms of food security in this country. So as Dame Glenys said, we're paying a lot of attention to soil. You'll see it featured in our report, and it is something that we at the OEP will be paying attention to, because we do recognise how important soil health is. So watch this space, I think.
Okay, great. Moving on to a question from Sandy. It's great to see the OEP key areas of focus include marine issues and also on accountability. On the latter, how does the OEP intend to help ensure that government and authorities continue to be subject to sufficient ability to challenge decisions?
I'm not sure I've quite understood the question. I can understand how any public authority needs to be accountable, but what was the intent behind the bit about challenging decisions? Have I not followed it properly?
I'll repeat it for you.
Thank you.
It's great to see the OEP key areas of focus include marine issues and also on accountability. On the latter, the accountability, how does the OEP intend to help ensure that government and authorities continue to be subject to sufficient ability to challenge decisions?
I think the question here is around public participation in decision making, and particularly the public's ability to challenge those decisions.
So if I can pick up on just one element of that and the OEP's role specifically. So as I said right at the beginning of the presentation, the OEP has a number of functions, and one of those functions is that we can receive complaints from members of the public regarding where public authorities may not have complied with their environmental legal obligations. Now, that complaint and investigation function is confined, as it were, to compliance with the environmental law. But actually, even from the complaints we've received so far, they're providing us with rich intelligence about how the entire environmental oversight system actually works in practice. And the OEP has those wider duties in relation to monitoring how environmental law is implemented, so how it's operating in practice, and also new laws. So when government is looking to improve those regulatory frameworks. So the OEP has a role in relation to direct accountability where that is linked to compliance with the law, but also we're able to capitalise and gain that broader insight from where members of the public bring matters to our attention. And even where we can't necessarily take forward a case to investigate through that particular channel, gaining that learning from the public and gaining that insight about what the public really do care about and what matters to them. And for example, we have done a number of public engagements, and some of the themes emerging from that is a real passion from the groups that we've engaged around, for example, the quality of our rivers and how waste is managed. These are things that are important to people. And we have a real opportunity as we grow and as we gain more experience to gain that insight and share it more widely.
Could I just come in on the back of that as well? And now I've better understood the question, thank you, is that just to say that we have set out in the consultation that we ran on our strategy how we intend to approach one of the functions we have, which is to monitor compliance with environmental law. And what our proposition is that we will take a very wide view of that. So we will look at how laws are implemented, including how regulatory regimes are designed and followed through. And what we proposed in our consultation was that we take a twofold approach. One is a regular sort of programme of oversight, but complemented really by deep dives. And those deep dive subject areas may well be informed by the complaints that Natalie's spoken about and the sort of issues that are coming up and the intelligence that's coming up from there and other sources. So we're going to do the best we can on that. And it's a great power. I don't think we've had it in this country before, a body able to monitor environmental law and advise government on how it can be yet better.
Okay, great. We've got time for one more question, and apologies for people that we haven't got back to. We have been noting down any other questions, and we will get back to you after the event. So our final question for today is from Kate Parminter, who says, you refer to the environmental principles statement as one of the 4 cornerstones. Do you think its publication today reflects the advice the OEP gave draft and to make it more ambitious and be clear on monitoring its application?
Good afternoon, Kate. Thank you very much for attending and for the question. Certainly the statement that's come out today is much better than the one that we were commenting on a few months ago. And we can see much of our advice reflected there, but not every aspect of our advice is reflected there. And of course, we will continue to press those matters.
Okay, great. So that brings us to the end of the event today. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us and participating. And once more, thank you for everyone who sent in the questions. We will be getting back to anybody we didn't quite get a chance to in this portion of the event directly, just to make sure that you get all your questions answered. So that's everything wrapped up from us today. I'd like to just hand over to Dame Glynis to just close the event and just thank you for everybody who attended.
Thank you so much, Jenna, and thank you for managing to host so well and keep us under control. Thanks to everyone who attended. It's really great. I'm looking at the attendance list, so many of you. I'm still looking forward to meeting, but actually at least we can meet electronically. I do hope you find our report interesting, that you find what we propose clear and compelling, and that you can join us in a combined effort to basically get the 25-year environmental plan that will come out in 2023 to be the best possible plan, and then we can see government bring itself around it for delivery. Thank you very much again, and I wish you well, and I hope you have a good evening when you get to it. Thank you.